One freezing morning, a millionaire CEO slammed on the brakes when he saw a barefoot little girl alone at a bus stop. Seconds later, she looked up at him and whispered one word that would change his life forever. Jonathan Blake, the CEO of a major investment company, sat behind the wheel of his black Range Rover as he drove along the familiar route to his office downtown. The morning was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that turned every breath into a plume of frost and made the sidewalks glisten with a thin layer of ice. He had always prided himself on his discipline, on his ability to keep every detail of his life perfectly under control, but on that morning, even the warmth of the heated leather seats and the distraction of urgent emails couldn't stop the unease slowly creeping into his chest. He sipped the last of his strong, bitter coffee and set the cup into the holder without taking his eyes off the road. Traffic lights reflected dully in the windshield, blending with the notifications popping up on his tablet beside him. He should have been thinking about quarterly reports, about the contracts waiting for his signature, about the endless list of calls he needed to return. That was the life he'd built, structured, predictable, efficient. But in the corner of his vision, something caught his attention, something that didn't belong in the sterile perfection of his daily commute. At an old bus stop, the metal bench rimed with frost, a small figure sat huddled. For a few moments, he thought he must be imagining it, perhaps a discarded bundle of clothes or a mannequin. But as he drew closer, he saw a thin, pale arm, bare feet pressed against the frozen concrete, and a small face half hidden by tangled blonde curls. The girl couldn't have been more than 6 years old. She wore a white dress and a thin pink sweater that looked more like an afterthought than protection against the cold. Jonathan's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he slowed to a crawl. She wasn't moving much, only the tiniest shiver passing through her narrow shoulders. Her lips were blue, her eyelids drooping as if she was too exhausted even to stay awake. He glanced in the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see someone, anyone, coming back for her. But the sidewalk behind him was empty, and the windows of the nearby buildings were dark. He pulled over without thinking about it, ignoring the exclamation of the navigation system telling him he was off route. For a moment, he simply sat there, breathing hard, his heart hammering in a way he hadn't felt since he was a boy. He had signed contracts worth millions without a flicker of anxiety, had faced down entire boards of directors with absolute calm. But now, looking at this child alone on a frozen morning, he felt something break loose inside him. He opened the door and stepped out into the cold. The air hit his face like a slap, sharp and unforgiving. He crossed the sidewalk, each step feeling strangely unsteady. The closer he got, the more he realized how small she really was. Her knees were drawn up to her chest, and her arms wrapped around them in a desperate attempt to hold in whatever little warmth she had left. Her hair was tangled and matted against her cheek, and her eyelids fluttered weakly as he approached. Jonathan stopped in front of her, crouching down so their eyes would be level. For a second, he almost forgot how to speak. He saw her gaze lift to meet his, blue irises dulled by cold and fear. In that one look, he could see everything she had endured: loneliness, confusion, the slow, creeping hopelessness of a child who no longer expected to be helped. "Hey," he said finally, his voice lower than he intended. "Can you hear me?" She didn't answer, but her lips parted in a dry, shallow breath. The faintest nod trembled through her. He realized he had been holding his own breath and let it out slowly, trying to keep his hands from shaking as he reached toward her. For a split second, he imagined what he must look like, a stranger in a dark blue wool coat, crouched in front of a freezing child. He didn't care. In that moment, nothing else existed: no reports, no meetings, no carefully managed schedules. Just this little girl in the snow and the certainty that he couldn't drive away and pretend he hadn't seen her. He was no longer thinking about consequences. He was thinking only of how cold she must be and how easily she could simply stop shivering and slip into the dark. And that was the one thing he couldn't allow. Jonathan reached out carefully, afraid that any sudden movement might frighten her. His hand hovered for a moment over her small shoulder before he finally rested his palm there, feeling the chill seep straight through his glove. Her skin was icy and clammy, and when she turned her head toward him, he saw her eyes searching his face as though she were trying to decide whether he was real or just something her mind had invented to comfort her before the end. He swallowed hard, fighting the tightness in his throat, and forced his voice to stay calm, steady, something she could hold on to. "It's all right," he whispered, aware that the words sounded hopelessly inadequate. "I'm here. You're not alone anymore." He thought she might flinch or try to pull away, but she didn't move. Only her eyes filled with a shine that could have been tears or simply the reflection of the winter light. He realized she was shivering so violently now that her teeth chattered, her frail body trembling as if it no longer knew how to be still. He slipped his other arm around her back, trying to shield her from the wind, and felt the thin ridge of her spine pressing against his forearm. She was so terribly small. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked softly, but she didn't answer. She only blinked, as if she couldn't remember how to form words. He knew he had to get her warm, to get her out of the cold as fast as possible. There would be time later for questions and explanations, but right now every second she stayed out here was a danger he couldn't accept. He shifted closer, his knees pressing into the icy concrete as he slid his arms under her. She was lighter than he had expected, her weight almost nothing, like lifting a bundle of frozen laundry. As he lifted her, her head lolled against his shoulder, and a small, broken sound escaped her lips. It was only then, with her face so close to his, that he heard her voice, thin and hoarse, the ghost of a word he almost didn't recognize. She looked straight at him, her pupils huge and dark against the pale blue of her irises, and her cracked lips moved in a whisper so quiet he had to bend his ear toward her to hear it. "Papa?" The word struck him harder than any accusation ever could have. He froze, holding her against his chest, feeling her ragged breath warming the fabric of his coat in tiny, fleeting puffs. For a moment he didn't know what to say. A part of him wanted to correct her gently, to tell her that he wasn't her father. But another, deeper part, some place inside him that had been locked away for years, couldn't bring himself to do it. He tightened his hold on her, feeling the cold of her bare feet where they brushed against his wrist, and something fierce and protective rose up in him, something that had nothing to do with logic or responsibility. "I'm here," he said finally, his voice almost breaking. "I won't leave you." The words were simple, but they came from a place he hadn't known still existed in him. He started walking toward the car, his steps unsteady on the icy pavement. She didn't respond, didn't even stir in his arms, and a terrible fear twisted in his stomach that he was already too late, that she had slipped past the point where warmth and comfort could reach her. He laid her gently across the back seat, arranging her as carefully as he could, tucking the thick wool blanket he kept for emergencies around her small body. Her eyelashes fluttered, but she didn't open her eyes again. He brushed a stray curl away from her forehead and felt how cold her skin was beneath his fingertips. The knowledge that she could have died here, alone and unseen, made something inside his chest ache so sharply he could hardly breathe. He closed the car door and climbed behind the wheel, his hands trembling as he started the engine and turned the heat up as high as it would go. He kept glancing into the mirror, watching her small shape beneath the blanket, willing her to move, to make some sign that she could hear him. As the car pulled away from the curb, he felt the gravity of what he had done settling over him. He had no idea what waited for them in the hours to come, no idea how he would explain any of this, but none of it mattered in that moment. All he could think was that she was still breathing, that she was no longer sitting alone on that bench, and that he had spoken a promise he could never take back. The ride to the hospital felt endless, though the streets were nearly empty and every traffic light seemed to turn green before he even reached it. Jonathan drove with one hand clenched tightly around the steering wheel while the other kept drifting back to the rear seat, as if the simple act of touching her shoulder through the blanket could somehow anchor her to consciousness. The heater was blasting full force, trying to drive out the cold that clung to her small body. In the mirror, he could see her pale face, her eyelids fluttering as if she were trapped in some dream she could not escape. Every so often, a soft, shallow breath lifted her chest, and each time it felt like a fragile reassurance that she was still here. When he finally pulled up to the emergency entrance, he left the engine running and practically sprinted around the car. He opened the rear door, and the warm air rushed out into the night, tangling with the freezing gusts that swept across the pavement. For an instant, he thought she might wake up when the cold hit her face, but she only lay there, motionless except for that faint, ragged breathing. He reached under the blanket and lifted her carefully, feeling again how terrifyingly light she was, how brittle her limbs seemed. As he carried her through the sliding doors, the nurse behind the reception desk looked up sharply. Without waiting for her to ask any questions, he heard himself saying words he had never imagined would leave his mouth. He didn't know when his voice had started shaking, but it cracked anyway, raw and exposed. He told them he had found her alone in the street, that she had been freezing, that she hadn't spoken more than a single word, and that she needed help now. The nurse reached out to check the girl's pulse, and Jonathan felt his heart hammering so loudly that he thought it might drown out everything else. A pair of orderlies appeared almost immediately with a gurney, and when they transferred her from his arms to the thin mattress, something in him rebelled at the idea of letting go. He had to force himself to step back as they wheeled her down the hall. The doors swung shut behind them, and he was left standing alone in the middle of the brightly lit corridor, the echo of his own footsteps chasing him as he moved to the nearest chair and sat down heavily. For the first time since he had seen her on the bus stop bench, he felt the adrenaline drain out of his body all at once. He pressed his palms over his face and tried to steady his breathing, but images kept flashing through his mind, the way she had looked up at him with those enormous eyes, the way her voice had cracked on that single, impossible word, Papa, the way she hadn't made another sound afterward. He didn't know how long he sat there, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the distant announcements over the intercom blending together in a monotone he barely heard. After what felt like hours, though the clock on the wall insisted it had only been 20 minutes, a doctor came to speak with him. Jonathan stood too quickly, his knees threatening to buckle under him. The doctor was a tall woman with kind eyes and a practiced calm that helped settle some of the chaos swirling inside him. She told him the child was stable for now. She had been suffering from severe hypothermia, mild dehydration, and exhaustion. They had started warming her gradually, given her fluids, and were monitoring her closely. He listened to every word as if his life depended on it, nodding, asking questions, making sure there was nothing else he should be doing. When the doctor finished, she asked gently if he was a relative. For a moment, Jonathan hesitated. The truthful answer, that he was a stranger, that he had only met the little girl an hour ago, felt too inadequate, too small for what had already passed between them. He settled on telling her that he was the one who found her and that he wasn't leaving until he knew she was all right. The doctor studied him for a moment and then seemed to understand something he couldn't have put into words himself. She didn't press further but simply led him to a small waiting area outside the pediatric ward, where a few chairs and a coffee machine sat in a sad little corner. The hours blurred together. Nurses came and went, sometimes giving him updates, sometimes just offering a quiet nod. He signed forms he barely read, answered questions he wished he had better answers for, and all the while kept replaying that fragile voice in his mind. Papa. No word had ever cut so deep or so cleanly through every defense he had spent his life building. He didn't know why she had said it. Maybe she had truly thought he was her father. Maybe it was only the desperate hope of a frightened child whose real father would never come back. But even now, sitting in the antiseptic hush of the hospital hallway, he knew he could never hear that word again and pretend it hadn't mattered. At some point just before dawn, the doctor returned to tell him that she was finally asleep and that her condition had stabilized. She suggested that he go home and get some rest, but Jonathan shook his head without even considering it. He asked instead if he could sit with her when she woke up. The doctor hesitated, then nodded slowly. When he was finally allowed to see her, the little girl looked impossibly small beneath the pale blanket, her skin still tinged with the faint gray of the cold that had almost taken her away. But her breathing was steadier now, and her hand twitched slightly on the mattress as though she was trying to reach for something in her sleep. Jonathan pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down without a word. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or what questions he would have to answer when the sun rose, but in that moment, there was only one thing that mattered: she was still here, and he was still beside her. Jonathan lost any clear sense of time as he sat by her hospital bed. Outside the window, dawn crept in slowly, diluting the darkness with a pale gray light that seemed to flatten every color it touched. He had spent the hours in a state of quiet vigilance, leaning forward whenever she stirred or let out a small, uneasy sigh in her sleep. Every time her eyelids fluttered, he felt his heart seize in his chest, afraid she might slip back into that unreachable place where no words or warmth could follow her. When she finally opened her eyes, it was so gradual he almost missed it, just the slow lift of heavy lashes and the first clear glimpse of those impossibly blue irises. For a long moment, she only looked at him without speaking. The machines around her emitted a steady, measured rhythm that felt louder in the silence. Her gaze shifted from his face to the 4-line taped to her arm, then to the thin blanket pulled up to her chin. She seemed to be trying to understand where she was, to piece together how she had gone from the freezing bus stop to this bright, sterile room. Jonathan swallowed and tried to find words that would not frighten her more than she already was. "Hi," he said softly, surprised by how rough his voice sounded after so many hours without speaking. "You're safe now. You're in the hospital. The doctors are taking good care of you." He waited, but she didn't answer. Her eyes just moved back to him, searching for something he didn't know if he could give. He shifted in his chair, leaning a little closer, hoping she would feel less alone if he didn't look so far away. "Can you tell me your name?" he tried again, keeping his tone as gentle as he could. Her lips parted slightly, and for a second he thought she might speak, but then she only shook her head, so slightly he almost missed it. He felt a flicker of helplessness. He wanted so badly to make this easier for her, to reassure her that everything was going to be all right, but he knew that no amount of kindness could erase what she had already endured. A nurse came in to check her vitals, offering Jonathan a small, sympathetic smile that told him she had seen more frightened children than he could imagine. As the nurse adjusted the 4 and made notes on her chart, she asked gently whether he was family. The question sent a twinge of guilt through him, but he only said he was the person who had brought the girl in. He knew it wouldn't be enough for long. Eventually, someone would demand a fuller explanation, and he would have to provide one, whether he felt ready or not. As soon as the nurse left, he looked back at the child and realized she was watching him intently again, her brows knitting as if she were trying to decide whether to trust him. He reached for the small plastic cup of water on the tray and offered it to her. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, and without thinking, he steadied her fingers in his own. The contact made something in his chest tighten, a painful recognition that she had no one else to do this for her. She sipped the water in tiny, cautious mouthfuls, and when she finally set the cup down, her gaze didn't drop to the sheets this time. "My name is Lillian," she whispered, her voice so hoarse it was barely sound at all. Jonathan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It felt like the first step across some invisible divide between them. He repeated her name softly, hoping it might anchor her, remind her that she still belonged somewhere, even if it was only here for now. "Lillian. That's a beautiful name," he said, and she watched him with a wariness that hadn't faded, but which now held something else, something like the first cautious spark of hope. A social worker arrived not long after, a woman named Margaret who introduced herself in the same calm, measured tone nurses used when they were afraid a child might break under too much attention. She sat with Jonathan in a small consultation room lined with children's drawings taped to the walls, all bright colors and happy stick figures that felt painfully out of place. Margaret had a folder in her lap, already filled with forms that would decide what happened next. She explained that Lillian's parents had died in a car accident 2 weeks earlier and that she had been living with an older relative who had apparently vanished without notifying anyone. No one had come looking for her. No one had even filed a report that she was missing. As Margaret spoke, Jonathan felt a slow horror creeping through him, a sick disbelief that the world could allow a 6-year-old child to fall through every net that was supposed to protect her. He realized he was gripping the armrest of his chair so hard that his knuckles were white. When she asked whether he was willing to stay involved in the case as a witness and possibly a temporary guardian if no family came forward, he didn't hesitate. He heard himself agreeing before the implications could fully settle in his mind. He would have said yes no matter what it cost him. By the time he returned to Lillian's room, the sun was fully up, slanting pale beams of light across her bed. She was awake, watching the doorway as if she'd been waiting to see if he would come back. He sat down and gave her a tired but sincere smile, and for the first time, she looked a little less afraid. He knew this was only the beginning. There would be interviews, court hearings, endless paperwork, and the question that would come again and again: why was he doing this for a child he had never met before that morning? But when he looked into her eyes, he already knew there was only one answer that mattered. He was doing it because the moment he had found her sitting alone in the cold, he had understood that he couldn't be the kind of man who walked away. It was late afternoon when Jonathan finally brought Lillian home. The hospital had insisted she be kept for observation until they were certain her condition was stable, but after days of tests and cautious monitoring, the doctors and social workers had all agreed she could leave as long as she had a safe place to go. The paperwork authorizing him as her temporary guardian felt heavy in his briefcase, every signature and notarized stamp a reminder that nothing about this was simple. He had never imagined he would find himself in this position, standing in the discharge lobby of a children's hospital with a little girl's hand tucked into his. She held onto his index finger rather than his whole hand, her grip so tentative that he kept expecting her to let go. The drive back to his house was silent. Lillian sat in the back seat, wrapped in the same soft blanket he had brought that first night, her gaze fixed on the passing city through the window. Every so often he would glance at her in the mirror, searching for some sign that she was afraid or overwhelmed, but her face remained expressionless in a way that worried him more than any tears. He remembered the doctor's warning that children sometimes shut down after trauma, withdrawing behind a kind of invisible glass. He told himself not to expect too much too soon, that she needed time to feel safe, but already he wanted so badly to see some spark of life return to her eyes. When they turned into the long driveway that curved toward his house, he saw her shoulders tense ever so slightly. The sprawling stone facade and tall arched windows seemed too grand even to him now. He parked and came around to help her out of the car, bracing himself for whatever reaction she might have. As she stepped onto the brick path, she tilted her head back, her wide blue eyes tracking up the height of the house, and for a moment he wondered if she thought she was being brought somewhere she might never be allowed to leave. He knelt beside her so she wouldn't have to look up at him and tried to speak in the calm, quiet tone she seemed to respond to best. "This is my home," he told her, forcing his voice to remain steady despite the doubt whispering at the edges of his mind. "You don't have to be afraid here. You can stay as long as you need to." She didn't answer, but she didn't look away from him either. He took it as the closest thing to agreement he was going to get. Together they walked to the front door, and he unlocked it with the same key he had used every day for years, only now it felt like he was crossing into completely unfamiliar territory. The entryway was bright, filled with late afternoon light slanting across the polished floors and the quiet order of carefully chosen furniture. He had always liked how calm his house was, how predictable. But when he glanced down and saw Lillian clutching the hem of her blanket as though she might need to shield herself, he wondered if it all looked cold and unwelcoming through her eyes. He showed her through the main room slowly, trying to make the unfamiliar space seem smaller, less intimidating. She said nothing, only watched him with her solemn gaze and looked around with cautious curiosity. When they reached the kitchen, he offered her a glass of milk and some toast, and this time she accepted without prompting, holding the cup in both hands so she wouldn't spill. He sat across from her and forced himself not to hover, even as every instinct told him to fuss over her, to ask if she was all right every 30 seconds. Later, he led her upstairs to the room he had prepared. The guest room had never been used for much more than storing extra linens, but he had stayed up the night before arranging it as best he could, trying to imagine what a child would need to feel safe. The bed was made up with fresh sheets and a quilt he had bought in a hurry after leaving the hospital, the pale pink fabric dotted with tiny flowers. A small stack of picture books sat on the nightstand. He felt almost foolish showing it to her, certain he must have missed something obvious, but when she stepped inside, she didn't shrink away or ask to leave. She just stood there, taking everything in. He moved to the window and opened the curtains wider so more daylight could reach the corners of the room. When he turned back, she was touching the edge of the quilt, smoothing it carefully beneath her small hand. Something in the gesture struck him, a reminder that she was still a child who noticed small comforts even when so much else had been taken from her. He cleared his throat and tried to keep his tone gentle. "This is your room now," he said. "You can put your things anywhere you like. If there's something you need, you only have to tell me." She didn't answer, but when she looked up at him, her eyes were less guarded than before. He decided not to say anything else that might make her retreat again. Instead, he stepped back and gave her the space to look around on her own. That first night was harder than he had expected. After he had tucked her into bed and wished her good night, he stood in the hallway with his hand on the door frame, listening for any sign that she might need him. He knew he should go, that she would never feel at ease if she felt watched every second, but when he finally walked to his own room, it felt wrong to be so far away. He ended up sitting on the edge of his bed, fully dressed, checking the monitor he had set up in her room so he could see that she was still there, still breathing. Hours later, long after the house had gone silent, he heard a small sound over the speaker, a muffled, choked sob. He was halfway down the hall before he realized he had moved, his feet carrying him back to her without any conscious decision. When he opened the door, she was curled on her side, clutching the edge of the blanket in both fists, her face buried in the pillow. He crossed the room and knelt beside her, his voice rough with exhaustion and something deeper he didn't want to name. "It's all right," he whispered. "I'm here." She didn't look up, but her crying grew quieter, as if hearing him had drained the last of her strength. He sat on the floor beside her bed until her breathing evened out again, and when he finally went back to his room, he left the door open between them. He lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, knowing that nothing about this would be easy and that he was already more committed to her than he could ever have planned. But even with the fear and the uncertainty pressing down on him, he knew that leaving her alone was not something he would ever do. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt as fragile as it was necessary. Jonathan woke early each morning, long before his alarm, and the first thing he did was check the monitor to be sure Lillian was still in her bed. The screen always showed her small shape curled beneath the quilt, her hair a pale halo against the pillow. Each time, he felt a wave of relief he could not entirely explain. She had only been there for a handful of nights, yet already the thought of finding her bed empty filled him with a dread he had never known before. He tried to keep his routine as consistent as possible, believing it might help her feel safer if she knew what to expect. Breakfast was always at the same time, set out on the kitchen table with quiet care. Lillian never said much in those early hours. She would sit across from him in her small chair, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze flicking between him and her plate as though she were still deciding whether this was all a temporary illusion. Sometimes she would take a few bites, and sometimes she would only stare down at the toast until it cooled. He never pressed her to eat more than she wanted, never asked her to explain how she felt. It seemed cruel to demand words she might not have yet. His house, which had once felt too big even for one person, now felt both fuller and more uncertain. Every room seemed to echo differently with her presence in it. He found himself noticing things he had never cared about before, the way the stairs creaked under her small feet when she came down in the mornings, the way her soft cough sounded in the hallway when she was too shy to call for him outright, the way she would hesitate before entering a room if she wasn't sure she was allowed to be there. He did what he could to show her that nothing in the house was off limits. When she lingered in the doorway of his study, looking at the tall shelves lined with books, he set aside his work and let her come in without saying anything at all. She wandered through the room in small, slow circles, her fingertips brushing the spines of volumes she couldn't yet read. He thought she might ask questions, but she didn't. She only looked around with that same silent curiosity, as though she were cataloguing this new life in her mind. Evenings were the hardest. After dinner, when the light began to fade from the windows and the house grew quiet, he often felt the weight of everything they weren't saying. He knew she must think about her parents, about the life she had lost so abruptly. He had asked the social worker whether it was better to speak of it or to wait until Lillian was ready, and she had told him gently that there was no single right approach. The important thing was simply to be there when she needed someone to listen. So he did the only thing he could think to do: he stayed nearby. Sometimes he would sit at the end of the sofa while she watched cartoons in cautious, fascinated silence, and other times he would read one of the picture books out loud even if she seemed only half attentive. One night, as he closed the last page of a story about a rabbit who lost his way and found it again, he felt her watching him with a gaze so intent that it made his throat ache. He set the book aside and waited, hoping she might finally feel ready to speak. When the words came, they were so soft he had to lean closer to be sure he heard them. "Will they come back?" she asked, her voice high and thin, the question he had been dreading since the first moment he saw her in that hospital bed. Jonathan took a steadying breath. He didn't want to lie, but he also couldn't bear to let her think she had been abandoned because she wasn't loved enough to keep. He rested his hand lightly over hers where it lay on the blanket between them. "They loved you very much," he said carefully, each word chosen so it would not break her already fragile trust. "But sometimes, bad things happen that no one can stop. They can't come back, sweetheart." He waited for her to cry or turn away, but she only lowered her eyes and sat very still. After a long moment, she spoke again in the same thin whisper. "Then who will stay with me?" The question struck something so deep in him he could hardly draw a breath around it. He had no prepared answer, no tidy reassurance that would fix what could never be fixed. All he had was the truth of what he knew, and what he had already decided the night he carried her out of the cold. "I will," he told her quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." Her fingers curled around his, so small and weightless that the contact felt almost like a plea. She didn't say anything else, but she didn't let go, and for the first time since she had come into his life, he felt something shift between them. It wasn't trust, not yet, and it wasn't exactly hope either. It was simply the beginning of a fragile understanding that he meant what he said. Later, after she had fallen asleep, he sat in the chair beside her bed with his hands clasped in his lap. He thought about how everything in his life had once felt so secure, so certain, and how in a single moment it had all changed. He no longer cared whether anyone would understand why he had chosen to take her in. What mattered was that she would never again have to wonder whether she was worth staying for. Jonathan had thought he understood the shape of what his life was becoming, but nothing had prepared him for the envelope that arrived in the mail on an ordinary Tuesday morning. He had been sitting at the kitchen table with Lillian across from him, watching as she slowly picked apart a slice of toast into neat crumbs she didn't eat. When the doorbell rang, he excused himself to answer it, thinking it was probably another delivery of supplies or forms he needed to sign. But when he opened the door, he found only a courier standing on the porch, holding out a thick envelope with the logo of a law firm he recognized from the most complex deals his company had ever handled. He thanked the courier and signed for it, feeling the first twinge of unease as he closed the door behind him. There was no reason for a firm like that to be contacting him about anything personal, or so he thought. But as he tore open the envelope and began reading the letter inside, he felt the floor under his feet tilt in a way that made him grip the edge of the countertop to stay upright. The letter was formal and precise, every line of it written in the neutral language of legal necessity, but the meaning was impossible to mistake. It turned out that years ago, when Lillian's parents had been struggling to keep their small business from failing, they had applied for a loan from the company Jonathan ran. At the time, it had seemed like one more case file in a stack of hundreds. He had signed the final authorization himself, approving the repayment terms that were, in retrospect, stricter than they should have been. When the accident had taken both her parents, the loan's insurance claim had been denied because of an error in their paperwork, an error that his own signature had effectively enforced. Without that money, the mortgage had defaulted. The family home had been sold at auction. He read the letter 3 times, hoping each time that he might find some mitigating detail he had missed, something that would excuse the part he had played in the collapse of everything Lillian had once known. But there was nothing to soften it. He pressed his thumb into the crease of the paper until the edge cut into his skin, unable to look away from the evidence of his own complicity. When he finally lifted his eyes, he saw Lillian standing in the doorway between the hall and the kitchen, her small face pale and uncertain. She hadn't spoken, hadn't even come close enough to see what he held, but somehow her presence made the guilt heavier, more suffocating. He folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope before she could ask any questions he wasn't ready to answer. For the rest of the morning, he moved through the house in a daze, unable to concentrate on anything. He called the law firm to confirm the details, though a part of him already knew it was all true. When he hung up, he sat at his desk with his head in his hands, trying to reckon with the knowledge that he had, however indirectly, helped set the stage for the day he had found her on that icy bench. He didn't know how to look at her without feeling that he had stolen something he could never repay. He kept thinking about how he had promised her she was safe now, that she wasn't alone. But how much of that promise was simply his own need to feel absolved? He had wanted so badly to be the person who rescued her that he hadn't stopped to wonder if he was the person who had failed her in the first place. As the day turned to evening, he realized he couldn't carry the secret in silence. It wasn't fair to her, even if she couldn't yet understand the full meaning of what had happened. He found her sitting in the corner of the living room, cradling a stuffed rabbit he had bought her on a whim. When he lowered himself onto the carpet beside her, she looked up at him with those wide, questioning eyes that always seemed to see more than he wanted to admit. "I have to tell you something," he began, and already his throat was tight with the words. "It's hard to explain. But I think you deserve to know." She didn't speak, only held the rabbit tighter. He took a slow breath and forced himself to continue. He explained, as simply as he could, that he had been part of the company that had lent her parents money. That when things went wrong, he had been one of the people whose decisions had made it harder for them to keep their home. He told her he hadn't known who they were then, that he hadn't realized what those papers really meant to a little girl he had never met. When he finally stopped talking, the silence felt like it might never end. Lillian's face was impossible to read. She looked down at her toy and traced one of its floppy ears with her finger. For a moment, he was sure she would turn away from him, that he had shattered the fragile trust they had begun to build. But when she finally looked up, her voice was so soft he almost missed it. "Did you know it was me?" she asked, her eyes searching his for something he didn't know how to name. "No," he whispered. "I didn't know. But if I had, I would have done everything differently. I'm so sorry." She nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion. Then she shifted closer and leaned her head against his shoulder. The touch undid him in a way nothing else could have. He wrapped an arm around her and held on, feeling the terrible weight of regret and the strange, fierce relief of knowing she had not pulled away. That night, after she had fallen asleep, he stood in the hallway outside her room, looking in at the curve of her back beneath the quilt. He knew there was no absolution for the part he had played in her loss. He could not rewrite what had happened. But as he watched her breathe, steady and even in the quiet, he also knew one thing beyond any doubt. He would spend the rest of his life trying to make it right. Spring came slowly that year, arriving first as a few timid green shoots pushing up between the stones of the walkway and then in bursts of pale blossoms along the hedge that bordered the property. Jonathan had never noticed the changing of the seasons in such detail before. He had been the kind of man who measured time in quarterly reports and fiscal deadlines, who barely looked up from his phone long enough to see whether it was raining or clear. But with Lillian in the house, the days unfolded differently. He began to see how much each small shift in the weather mattered to her, how she would stand by the window watching the rain slide down the glass, or trace her finger along the edge of a flower petal in the garden as if it were something miraculous. They had settled into a kind of tentative peace, though neither of them pretended the past could simply be erased. The night he had told her the truth about his part in her family's losses had changed something between them, but not in the way he had feared. Instead of pushing him away, she seemed to grow a little more certain that he meant it when he promised not to leave her. There were still long stretches of silence between them, but the silences no longer felt so precarious, no longer held the constant threat of shattering what they were trying to build. One morning, he woke to find her sitting at the kitchen table with a drawing in front of her. It was done in soft crayons, the lines a little shaky but clear enough that he knew what she meant to show him: a house with a tall roof and a figure standing in the doorway. Next to the figure was a small shape holding one of its hands, and though she didn't say so, he understood that she was telling him something he hadn't dared hope she felt. That this place, in some quiet, cautious way, had started to feel like home. He knelt beside her chair, studying the picture, and when he looked up she met his gaze without looking away. "It's us," she said simply, her voice soft but steady. "It is," he agreed, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could draw a full breath without guilt hollowing out his chest. In the weeks that followed, they began spending more time outside. The first warm afternoon, he suggested they go to the park. He half expected her to refuse, but to his surprise, she nodded almost immediately. When they arrived, she didn't cling to him the way she had during their earliest outings. Instead, she walked a few steps ahead, turning back now and then to make sure he was still behind her. At the edge of the grass, she paused to slip off her shoes, her small feet pressing into the new green growth. For a moment she stood there, her hair lifting around her face in the breeze, and he was struck by how different she looked from the child he had first carried into the hospital. She was still thin, still easily tired, still wary in ways that broke his heart. But she was also something else now, something he could only think of as quietly brave. She turned and lifted her arms in an unspoken invitation, and he walked to her and lifted her into the air. She let out a startled laugh, the sound bright and clear, and in that instant he felt every question he had ever asked himself about whether he deserved to be the one caring for her fade into something simpler. It didn't matter how it had begun. What mattered was that she was here, that she was laughing, that she trusted him to catch her when she reached for him. Later, they sat together under a flowering tree, the petals drifting down around them like confetti. She leaned against his side, her small hand resting on his knee, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. He thought about how impossible it would have seemed, only a few months ago, that he could feel this kind of peace. He had spent his life believing that purpose came from ambition, from achievement. But sitting there with Lillian pressed close to his side, he knew he had never understood what it meant to be needed, not in any way that mattered. As the sun began to sink lower, she tilted her head back to look up at him, her blue eyes solemn but no longer afraid. "Will you always stay with me?" she asked, her voice as soft as the falling petals. He felt his throat close around the words he wanted to say. He reached up to brush a lock of hair from her cheek, and when he spoke, his voice came out steadier than he felt. "I will," he promised, feeling the truth of it settle into his bones. "I won't ever leave you." She nodded as if she had known all along what his answer would be, and then she leaned her head against his shoulder, her breathing slow and even. He held her there while the last of the light faded, the warmth of her small body anchoring him more firmly than any promise he had ever made in a boardroom. When he finally carried her back to the car, she didn't wake, only curled closer against his chest with a sleepy sigh. He knew there were still questions ahead, still days when the past would catch up to both of them in ways neither could predict. But as he buckled her gently into the seat and brushed a kiss across her hair, he felt certain of one thing. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And that, he thought, was all the redemption either of them needed. In the end, this story isn't really about guilt or even redemption, it's about the unexpected, quiet ways that love can take root where there was only emptiness. I think what makes it powerful is how neither of them set out to save the other, but somehow they both ended up rescued. There's something deeply hopeful in that, a reminder that even the worst mistakes don't have to be the end of the story. Sometimes, healing begins the moment someone chooses to stay, no matter how complicated it is to love what's been broken.